Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Melinda Herring, and I am the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thank you for joining us. Today, we are going to examine the counteroffensive in Ukraine. We have 5 phenomenal experts, and we're very excited about this panel. Thank you, C-SPAN, for joining us as well. We have an hour together. We're going to have a conversation, and then at the tail end of the conversation, we invite you to put your questions into the chat or to send us questions on Twitter, and I'll be glad to read them and direct them to the right person. So without further ado, we have welcome Max Boot, who is the Jeane Kirkpatrick Fellow in National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a fabulous contributor to the Washington Post. We have General Philip Breedlove, who's the former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe and a great friend of the Eurasia Center and a board director. We have Dara Masakat, who's a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation, and anything she writes is worth reading. We have Vivian Salama, who's a national security correspondent at the Wall Street Journal, and she's fresh back from Kherson, so really glad to have her. And finally, we have Andrei Zagornyuk. He's going to be a couple minutes late, but he's the former Minister of Defense. He's a distinguished fellow at the Eurasia Center, and he's chairman of a great think tank in Kiev called the Center for Defense Strategies. If you're not getting his daily updates, get online and have a look. Center for Defense Strategy is really helpful. So I want to make the most of our time and go to General Breedlove. Kick us off, please. 2 weeks ago, Ukraine launched its long-awaited counteroffensive to retake territory in the south. How much territory do you expect Ukraine to liberate, and what are the challenges they'll face, and how are things going so far? General Breedlove, the floor is yours, sir.
So thank you for having me, and what a great group. I look forward to several of these folks grading my paper and correcting my answers. To hit the large question first, I really believe that this offensive can have a major effect on this war. But I will caveat that by saying up front and rolling a grenade out on the table. And that is to be determined by leaders in the West. If we are going to provide Ukraine what it needs, Ukraine has the wherewithal, the fielded forces, and the will to make a difference. And so largely how this rolls out will depend on what the West has done to help supply the effort. Skipping now to kind of what we see on the ground, and there are several here who have more recent experience than me, so I hope that they'll add some points as well. It appears that despite all of the news, and there is an aggressive disinformation campaign out there about what's going on in the South, learned individuals on the ground and reporters are seeing successes, limited successes at this point, successes by the Ukrainian forces, and they appear to be trying, as you know, the whole area is dominated by a series of rivers and river inlets and bodies of water, and they are attempting to use the geography and the limited throughput and roads and bridges to, in their attack, divide the Russian forces and make them feel exposed and vulnerable on the west side of the river, causing major problems for Russia. And they are having some small town by town successes, probably nothing that we would call major at this point, but the major point is that in some way they are moving forward. They are meeting some resistance. As you know, Russia has added to their forces in the area. But the bottom line is Ukraine is having some limited successes. And I think I'll leave it at that because the confusion out there is important. The biggest point to walk away from here, though, is that I believe Russia is beginning to feel vulnerable in the South. And you saw some hints by some senior Russian leaders yesterday of the possibility of resuming talks, albeit to meet only the Russian objectives. But the mere fact that they're coming back to the table, I think, says something about what they're feeling in the South.
Thanks so much, General Breedlove. Dara, would you jump in here and build on General Breedlove's point? So we have a press blackout. It's really hard to get information. How do we figure out what's actually going on? And say more about the disinformation you're seeing too, please.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. So as we were talking about in the beginning, it's really hard to make sense of what's going on, even for someone who's been dealing in this space for a long time. You see it coming from both sides. On the Russian side, Russian Telegram in particular, what I often do is look at the negative space, what they're not showing. For example, if you go through the major channels right now, no one's really talking about what's happening in Kherson. I suspect that's some self-limiting behavior. They're not supposed to talk about too much, or they could trip up new Russian laws that basically consider anything the Kremlin doesn't want to be a felony offense. Also, I look at Ukrainian social media too to make sense of what's happening. Trying to keep in mind that this is an active, ongoing battle. People are not providing detailed information on day-to-day operations, and I understand that. It just makes it a little difficult to make heads or tails of it from an analytic perspective. What I assume is similar to what General Breedlove mentioned, that both sides are not really, they don't really possess anything that they would consider a major victory at this point, because otherwise they would show it. They would discuss it. That goes for the Russians or the Ukrainian side. So right now I'm just basically patiently waiting for updates.
Great, thanks, Dara. We're so glad to have you here finally. Vivian, you just got back from Kherson and you've seen up close what this offensive looks like. What did you see, and what other challenges do the Ukrainians face in trying to liberate this territory that haven't been mentioned? Oh, you're muted, Vivian.
Melinda, thank you so much for having me. I spent almost 2 weeks doing a slow crawl from Odessa eastward into Kherson province. And it was a really interesting dynamic that you saw there, geography being a huge factor in all of this. And what I mean by geography is just the landscape of the South and the weapons that they were receiving from the US as being very beneficial. Now, we know for months now, the Ukrainian forces have been literally begging US and other allies to send longer range missiles, longer range systems to help them. And in the South, that was especially critical because we are talking about vast fields of watermelon and wheat and sunflowers, and there's really no cover for these soldiers. And one of the things that I heard from them, and I probably visited over a dozen checkpoints and front lines, a combination of the two. Some of them were quieter than others. Some were being really, really hammered while we were there. And one of the things they were saying is because of the geography, because of those fields, they don't have cover. And between Russian forces being so skilled in using drones, whereas the Ukrainians have really struggled with that because the Russians are very good at jamming their drones. And then secondly, the Russians are so good at digging trenches and utilizing them to their advantage. They had just been getting completely hammered and having to fall back further and further and further. When they got the HIMARS in late June, early July, they started seeing results. And I mean, literally, it was like a flip of a switch, where a week before we had gone there, my team and I, we were hearing that they were one of the units that we visited in Kherson Oblast had seen basically a massacre. They had lost tons of forces. And when we went and saw them a week after that horrible battle, they were sitting in a courtyard, taking a break, smoking their cigarettes, and kind of just like getting a few minutes of downtime. Clearly very traumatized by what had happened to them, but they said straight out that already, even though they had just received the HIMARS, it gave them a little bit of an edge. They were able to inch forward, and they had just recaptured a small village near to where we were. And so they do see that to them as a huge advantage. Just the fact that they are able to make a few feet worth of gains for them is a big change to what had been happening previously, where they were getting hammered. Now, they recognize that a few feet is hardly a major victory, but it is for them a victory. Though it could be the opposite. And so they're very optimistic now. They believe that more HIMARS will continue to make a difference, but it's going to be a slug. No matter what we say, no matter how many HIMARS they get, the Russian forces are pouring in resources to these areas. They're utilizing whatever advantages they have in the landscape as far as supply routes along the rivers, bombed out bridges, whatever they can use to their advantage to hold off Ukrainian forces, they are doing so. And the Russian government has no problem just piling soldiers in, even as they get massacred one after the other by Ukrainian forces. It's sort of this like endless supply, or so they think, of Russian forces. And so it's been a struggle for them. And I spent a lot of time in Kharkiv as well. There's a lot of differences I saw on that front line to what we saw in the South, but the South, they do believe at this stage, they are in a position to make incremental gains. It's going to be a long way to go, but it's a change from what we saw just a couple of weeks ago. And so that is something very positive.
Vivian, two follow-up questions for you. Are these numbers correct? At one point, the Ukrainians were saying that they were losing up to 200 men a day. And after HIMARS, I think it was closer to 30. Are those numbers correct? Or what did you hear in your reporting? Go ahead. Thank you.
Those are the official numbers that we keep on hearing, and anecdotally from what I was hearing from the various units on the front line, it does seem like they are losing far fewer soldiers. Definitely the units that I visited were telling me that much, that they were losing men left and right. There were a couple of battles that were just really ugly as recently as early July. And not only were they losing fewer soldiers, but they were also making gains as a result of the HIMARS coming in. And so definitely just with that alone, they believe that that is a huge advantage to them because, between manpower and losing the loss of weapons, the loss of drones, all of those things have been very critical for them to make even the slightest gains. And they do believe now that that is changing in their favor.
And what are the military guys you talked to on the Ukrainian side saying about the time frame for the counteroffensive? Is it months, weeks, 6 months? What kind of time frame are they looking at?
Melinda, it's funny that you asked that because when you ask, I interviewed the Minister of Defense while there. It was my second time interviewing him this year. And he was very positive and believed, maybe late summer, early fall, where you could start seeing targets against Crimea with the long range missiles. You could start seeing some gains. Maybe they'd be in Kherson by this point, by maybe late September, early October. You talk to the soldiers and they'll tell you a very different story. They'll tell you, you know what, let Kyiv think whatever it wants. We're the ones on the front line, and we believe that it's going to be a lot longer than that. They were very sober about their assessment for what the time frame was. They didn't want to kind of give any estimate, but what they said is, we know when we're ready. We know when this battle is going to tip in our favor, and we're just not there yet. And so I caution people to kind of, take what you're hearing from the government and the spokespeople for the armed forces with a grain of salt, because when you go to the front lines, the commanders of those forces will tell you something very different, and they are a lot more conservative about any kind of estimates. They do believe that those estimates being out there in the public is good for momentum to keep soldiers revved up and have them, believe that this battle is in their favor. But when you go there and you see the traumatized look on their faces and just like how brutal and how slow and painful this battle has been, you recognize that, there's truth to both stories in terms of maybe an average somewhere in the middle of what the time frame could be.
Thanks a lot. That's really helpful. Max, I'd like to bring you in here. Can we talk a little bit about time? So in the analytical community, the journalist community, we have this long argument about, is time on Russia's side or Ukraine's side? I'd like to hear your views on that. And do you think Ukraine is facing a race against the clock to make big gains before winter sets in? And what do you think realistically can happen before winter sets in? The floor is yours, Max.
Well, I've gone back and forth on that question of his time on Russia or Ukraine side, and you can make arguments on for both sides. But what I would say, big picture right now, is that certainly the fate of Kherson in the south remains to be very much determined, just as there's a lot to be determined in the east as well. But I think the bigger picture is right now, I think it's fair to say that Ukraine has already won its war of independence. Because remember, when Putin launched this evil war of aggression on February 24th, his plan was to march into Kyiv in 3 days. He was going to take over the entire country in a matter of weeks. And pretty clearly that has not happened, and it's not going to happen. Putin hoped to break Ukraine apart and to dominate most of it and to annex most of it to Russia. That's not going to happen. Instead of leading to division in Ukraine, the Russian invasion has led to Ukrainian unity. And it's just striking to see polls which show that well over 90% of Ukrainians believe that the war will be successful, and they support the President Zelensky and his conduct of the war. So there is rock solid Ukrainian support for the war effort right now. I think there have been some hidden victories for Ukraine that have not gotten the attention they deserve. For example, the July 22nd agreement under which Russia agreed to allow Ukraine to start exporting grain and other agricultural goods once again under UN auspices. This is helping to spike the food weapon that Putin was using to try to bludgeon Ukraine and its allies. And so far, I would say on the economic front, the Russian energy weapon has also not produced the results that Putin has wanted, because he thought that by threatening energy cutoffs, he could lead Europe to sever support for Ukraine. And that's not happening. I think the Europeans are still hanging tough. They're finding ways around Russian energy, despite the recent cutoff of the Nord Stream 1 pipeline and so forth. And certainly support in the U.S. remains very strong and still largely bipartisan, despite the kind of Russophile rump caucus within the Republican Party. So, and overall, obviously NATO has been strengthened with Sweden and Finland joining. So Putin is not achieving his objectives, and it wasn't just his initial objective of taking over all of Ukraine that he has not achieved. He hasn't even achieved his intermediate objective laid out in April of taking all of Donbass. That hasn't happened either. The Russians did manage to take Donetsk province, but they really haven't made any gains in the Donbass beyond that. And now the Ukrainians have the initiative. The Ukrainians are on the offensive. And I just want to stress, we're talking about like, what is the nature of the Ukrainian offensive? Very hard to say. What are the prospects? But I think the important point here is right now, more than 6 months into the war, the Russians have suffered very heavy losses, and the Ukrainians are on the offensive, and the Ukrainians have the momentum. And, to get back to a point that General Breedlove made, if we would just step up aid to Ukraine, I think they can make dramatic gains on the ground. I mean, look, they've turned around this war with fewer than 20 HIMARS systems. I mean, imagine what they could do with 60 HIMARS and longer range ATACMS rockets, with F-16s, with M1 tanks. We have all this stuff. We should be giving it to the Ukrainians. They can put it to very good use. But even without that stuff, I think they have the momentum right now. And we don't know the final outcome of the territory in Ukraine, but I think we can say that Putin has not achieved his war aims. He will not achieve his war aims. Ukraine has basically won its war of independence. And now the question is, how much of its own territory will Ukraine control? But the question of whether there will be an independent, pro-Western democratic state in Ukraine or not, I don't think that is any longer on the table. I think Ukraine has achieved a massive, massive victory in that regard.
Super. Thanks, Max. You have been such a clear and consistent voice throughout this invasion. And you and General Breedlove and others have urged the administration to provide more and better weapons. But there's an argument we keep hearing from the White House, from the Biden administration, from the National Security Council. And that argument is Russian escalation. The Biden administration keeps insisting that Russia can escalate and that we can't go too far. And they keep changing that red line. We've seen him do it over and over again. What do you think? What do you make sense? How do you respond to that escalation argument?
I agree that we should not be sending U.S. troops to fight in Ukraine, even though the Soviets and the Chinese certainly sent their forces to fight us in Korea and Vietnam, and with Russians operating fighter aircraft shooting at Americans in Korea and so forth. I'm not advocating that we do that, but I think pretty much anything short of direct American military intervention, I think is fair game. And I don't really understand the logic that says like, oh, we can send Ukraine rockets with a range of like 40 to 50 miles, but we can't send them rockets with a range of 150 to 180 miles. And so if we do the 50 mile rockets, that's okay. But if we do the 150-mile ones, Putin will launch World War III. I just don't see that. I don't see any indication that Putin is suicidal or that he's about to launch a nuclear war. I mean, yes, he is evil and he has miscalculated. And truthfully, we've miscalculated in our wars too. So it's not a sign that you're deranged or irrational. It just means that you were the victim of very bad intelligence. And I think the Russians were the victims of very bad intelligence in Ukraine. But we've seen that Putin has made very rational moves. Once he saw that Kiev wasn't going to fall, he retreated and focused on the Donbass, where he thought he could make gains. He has been, I think, in some ways, although the invasion itself is is an act of supreme evil. He has been largely somewhat fairly cautious in how he has been conducting himself. He has not been attacking NATO countries, very notably, even though, we know all the military equipment is coming to countries like Poland. Is he attacking Poland? No, because he doesn't want to start World War III. So, I don't think we need to worry too much about, triggering Putin by sending more military equipment, as long as we're not sending American troops. And the Ukrainians are not going to use F-16s to bomb Moscow. That's not going to happen. But I just think that they need more of these capabilities to try to retake more of their lost territory.
Wonderful. Thank you. General Breedlove, I saw you shaking your head. I know you want to jump in there on the escalation point. What else did Max miss, or did he nail it?
I was shaking my head up and down and left and right because I was agreeing with things he said and I was agreeing with things he was saying were wrong. So I'm in pretty violent agreement with most of what Max said. The bottom line is we are deterred. And Mr. Putin is doing a very good job of deterring us. And we have to figure out, one, how to get out from behind them. 3 presidents in the past have stood up to Russia amongst every bit as tough of situations. We took almost a battalion of Wagner troops off the face of the earth in northern Syria. We flew relief and supplies into Georgia while really there was a lot of war still being fought. We stood up in the Cuban Missile Crisis and came out the other side of that just fine. And I agree with Max. I don't think that he's suicidal. We have to respect what he is saying, but others have respected what the Russians have said, and they've stepped out and taken those right steps. And I believe that as now 2 or 3 of us have said, the Ukrainians are succeeding in many ways, but we are very much throttling their approach to the war and doing that by limiting supplies, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that really what's happening right now is a policy decision more than anything else.
Thank you so much, General Breedlove. Andrei Zagornyuk, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you here. This is a question. Andrei was he was Zelensky's first defense minister, and he's a great friend of the Atlantic Council, one of our distinguished fellows. Hey, Andrei. This is a question for you and Dara. You guys are really good specialists on the Russian army. So I'd like to ask you, Andrei, and then Dara, can you please assess the Russian army 6 months in? Many say that their morale is breaking and that no one wants to serve in Ukraine. They also argue that Russia is using old missiles and running out of equipment. That's one school of thought. Others say that Russia has plenty of sophisticated weapons, but it just hasn't moved them. How strong or weak is the Russian side, and how long can they hold out? Andrei first, and then Dara, please. Go ahead, Andrei.
So I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. We definitely cannot say that Russian army is completely exhausted and has no capabilities left whatsoever. We see that they've been exhausting the stocks and the parts of their overall capability, which they sent to Ukraine, because we have destroyed like an enormous amount of weapons. We're talking about hundreds of planes and helicopters, thousands of vehicles, and obviously like tens of thousands of casualties. At the same time, they do currently hire new recruits. They bring in additional units, and essentially all these targets which they put to their generals when forming new units, all those targets are delivered. So they cannot say that they cannot hire people. Of course, the devil is in details, and in our case, it's for us it's better because the quality of the force which they're shaping currently is very low, and they also have some specific units which they hire literally from the street with no background, with no training, and they train them, and they have national units, and they have these bars units which are essentially like absolutely no novices and with no background experience, and they have all kinds of options in order to avoid the fact that indeed there is no like overwhelming desire of Russian people to join the army in the quantities which they expect. So I would say that indeed they certainly cannot escalate. Since I've heard a bit of conversation on the escalation, they certainly cannot double the effort right now. But I believe they can continue with the current intensity, where they can continue with the current presence of the troops. They can continue here, have 150,000 troops around the Ukraine on different operational directions for quite a long time. The good news is that yes, the readiness of those troops and the level of their training and capability, and generally the level of like, let's say, quality of that capability is going to be lower and lower. And so as this war goes, of course they would be losing more people, and that desire to join would be diminishing. I have to say that they also mobilizing civilians in the temporary occupied areas, and what they do with them is completely disastrous and disgusting, because they're putting them on the front line, on the first line. And we already heard that in some cases they were retreating, and they were shot as they retreated. We basically meaning that they are throwing them as a cannon fodder in order to die first, and then the rest of the Russian troops participate. But that's what currently is happening. Now, question is about the statement that they still have a lot of sophisticated equipment. They do have a lot. They run out of the caliber missiles to let's say over 60%, we believe. Same thing with Iskander, maybe even higher. But at the same time, they still have quite a lot. At the same time, they cannot completely deplete their stocks to Ukraine. So they cannot be in a situation when they have no weapons at all. So of course they will keep the reserves. They will keep the reserves on different parts of the world. They still try to maintain the global posture. So they would be keeping presence in the Pacifics, in Central Asia, and so on and so on. So question is not like what Russia has. Question is like what Russia can commit to Ukraine, and what they are happy to commit, and what they can actually put in order to progress with this invasion effort. And we believe that they don't have enough to progress substantially. We think that currently we managed to stop their advances, and we believe that in the case if we receive when we receive more weapons, we will be able to push them out on a certain directions quite well. So I guess we're seeing currently like the Russian army in a quite damaged state. It cannot be underestimated, but it's certainly not capable of invading Ukraine. So that sort of massive target which they put, like that objective, it's unattainable at the moment at all. This is about land. Sorry, this is about land. I will be very quick with 2 sentences. So of course, this is completely very interesting and disastrous for Russian situation in the maritime domain, because we essentially with a few ships which we downed, we keep them basically in the harbor. So we exercise that access denial concept, and since we're going to continue, I think the prospects of Russian Black Sea Fleet is very bad. I think we can actually think of we can see it being like completely destroyed or diminished to the point that it plays very limited role. It's optimistic, but I think it's achievable, and certainly they don't play that role which they planned to play originally. And obviously the fact that we didn't allow them to get the air superiority, and we still our air defense is still reasonably capable and still doing some great job in a whole number of areas. I think it's remarkable. But I'm
going to stop you there. I promise to come back to you. Dara,
sure.
What did Andre miss? Anything else in your assessment of the Russian military 6 months in?
I agree with Andre on most of his assessment. I would note that of all of Russia's acute problems with personnel shortages and losing some of their best equipment in the early phases, expending so many of their high precision munitions, they're trying to take this plan B ad hoc way to overcome these challenges, right? So they're drawing between 9 to different pools of people to try to fill fill spots on the front line. They're recruiting from prisons. There's rumors they're recruiting from psychiatric institutions. I mean, it's just really trying to get bodies and put them on the front line, receiving anywhere between 1 to 4 weeks of basic training at most. This is really not a successful way to solve this problem, as one might expect. It will allow them to replenish the current front lines, but I share the assessments of the group that this is not something that is going to allow them to make really rapid gains forward. They just can't do it. But there is an effort at replenishment underway. With respect to the equipment that they lost, they really lost not only just the equipment itself, but the best trained crews that operate them. So tanks, artillery, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, some of their best equipment just got absolutely shredded, particularly up north. They can't readily recover from that. Now they do have thousands of pieces of equipment, stuck in storage. It's been sitting in open Siberian fields for 15 years now. Not all of it works. Not all of it works well. They are probably going to start cannibalizing it for parts. They are drawing upon equipment and they're putting it into Ukraine. So from the Ukrainian soldiers' perspective, they do see Russia as someone that can draw on sort of a unlimited kind of armor to put against this. But again, it's not going to be as effective. With respect to the missile question, Russia has plowed through some of its best precision strike munitions. They're trying to take different approaches to overcome that, repurposing air defense missiles in a land attack role. They lose a lot of accuracy. So what you see is even more collateral damage on Ukrainian civilian buildings and unintended targets. You also see the Russians dipping into their anti-ship cruise missile inventory. And that was a very large stockpile, several thousand that are conventional and have pretty decent precision. So they're going into that already. Where it has been lost and where you see a really big difference is in Russian tactical aviation. Their fighter aircraft are really, really low on tactical short-range precision munitions. And so what you end up seeing is Russian fighters flying very low to the ground, firing off unguided rockets, and then banking out of there to try to avoid Ukrainian air defenses. This should have been, Russian air power should have been a huge advantage for Russia and Ukraine, and they weren't able to make it happen. So bottom line, a lot of challenges, muddling through, but the Russians are putting down markers that this is not over for them. They might have to extend their timelines for their objectives. The larger objectives remain unchanged. I, however, looking at the structure that they have left, remain pretty pessimistic that they are going to ever be able to achieve that larger objective for half of Ukraine or Kyiv, or all of that, even in the long term, 5 to 10 years out, it would be, I think, too much to ask.
That was super helpful, Dara. I think the follow-up and obvious question is, what's the best they can do given all of the constraints that you just outlined? Can they take up to the Dnieper? Given what you know about both sides, what's the best Russia can do and hold?
Well, what they think they can do is annex Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson Oblasts. And my view is they're going to try to annex it into Russia, so that will force a sort of a shock to the system, and that that would impact the West's willingness or desire to continue to assist Ukraine at current levels. That's what they think that they're going to do. I see a lot of challenges for them right now, particularly with the offensive in Kherson. There's a lot of vulnerable Russian troops right now on the wrong side of the river. The bridges are blown. They're ferrying them across, dozens of vehicles at a time, ferrying them across the river. Sometimes I wonder if I'm in a general staff war game simulation. How did it get to this point for them? But I do think that's going to be a challenge. They do not possess all of Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia. Now Kherson is under threat. Just, I think yesterday, they announced that they were going to delay the referendum in Kherson from September to November because the security situation is so poor. So to me, that's what victory looks like in the near term for Ukraine, is these pushing that back, delaying that process, preventing them from feeling like they have a solidified frozen conflict line. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. Vivian, we haven't talked at all about the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhzhia. There's a couple of things that stand out. So the Russians keep trying to disconnect it and to get very close to scary situations where they don't have very much fuel to cool down the nuclear reactors. And the Russians were also very oddly willing to cooperate with the international community. What do you make of all this?
Well, the Russians like to demonstrate that they are cooperating with the international community, because they don't want to have sort of that hanging over their heads, even though, you know, a lot of it is very superficial. And we saw it even with some of the hostage negotiations and things like that, where the UN had taken a role, and they were open to that just because they do like to show even superficially that they are cooperating. And so the IAEA team were able to access the plant. We're actually waiting for a briefing from them today to find out what their assessment is, so that we could know the exact situation. But obviously it's a very dire, very serious situation there, where you have fighting near any nuclear plant. They were near Chernobyl as well earlier this year, but Chernobyl is not anywhere near as critical as the Zaporizhzhia power plant. And so there's a lot of concern about, you know, any kind of damage, any kind of fighting near a nuclear power plant is something that is considered a very serious situation. And theoretically, the Russians also know that, even though they would be happy to foment any kind of chaos to tip the scales in their favor. They do appear to understand that any kind of damage to a nuclear plant would not bode well for their efforts as well. And, you know, we even saw it in Chernobyl earlier this year, where they allowed the Ukrainian specialists to stay there basically as hostages, but they allowed them to stay there because they recognized that they couldn't operate the plant on their own, and they did not want anything to go wrong. So there is a sense that the Russians do recognize the stakes, albeit they're going to blame the Ukrainians for being the ones to cause the disruption around the plant, which is pretty laughable. And so that's sort of where we stand now. It will be very interesting to see what the IAEA team come out with following their visit this week. But the situation is pretty dire, and whether or not the plant can stay online, that is a big concern. It's down to the sort of its last legs as far as operation goes, and so the impact of that could be really critical, not just for Ukraine but for the whole of Europe. And so that's why there's so much concern across the continent about the outcome of this situation and the security of that plant.
Wonderful. Max, I want to turn to you. A couple people are asking about your comments about Congress. You're so clear on this point. Can you please explain why supporting Ukraine is in America's national interest? It's 5,000 miles away, and we have big midterm elections coming up very soon. Do you expect support for Ukraine to remain strong after these elections? Or what do you think? There's some polling that shows that there's some serious partisan differences when it comes to the support. And Bob McConnell pointed out that a bunch of Republicans had voted against the $40 billion bill. So tell us where you think things are going politically.
Well, just to answer the first part first, very briefly, I think the U.S. has a massive stake in the outcome of the war in Ukraine, which can be boiled down to: do we want to live in a world where the rule of law governs, or do we want to live according to the law of the jungle? That's basically what we're talking about. This is the very foundation of the post-1945 order in Europe and in the world that Putin is undermining. He is attacking not just Ukraine, he is attacking the very principle that borders will not be changed by force, and that nations can be free from aggression from their neighbors. And so if we allow Putin to get away with what he's doing in Ukraine, it'll be a terrible tragedy for Ukraine. And we're seeing that the Russians are committing horrific war crimes, all over the country. This is a humanitarian tragedy and nightmare, the likes of which Europe has not seen since World War II. But beyond the horrible tragedy for the people of Ukraine, I think this would be a tragedy for the people of Europe, especially for Eastern European states, which are next going to be in Russia's sights. He's not going to be satisfied with taking Ukraine as part of his project of resurrecting the Russian/Soviet Empire. And of course, there are a lot of countries, including some currently in NATO, that used to be part of the Soviet Empire, which are going to be in Putin's crosshairs if he wins in Ukraine, which he's not going to do, but if he were. And it would also send a horrible, dispiriting message to countries like China, which are contemplating their own attack on Taiwan, for example, which is a war that could easily drag in the U.S. into World War III. If Putin can get away with what he's doing in Ukraine, I think that would be a signal to China they can get away with anything they want in Taiwan. And conversely, if we show that no, the entire civilized world, the West, is united in stopping Russia, that it will be defeated. I think that will send a very positive message that aggression does not pay, that the rule of law still means something, and that there is still a unity and coherence in the West to stand up for our shared transatlantic ideals. So the stakes could not possibly be higher. I think this is probably the most consequential conflict since 1945, and really the future shape of Europe is being determined on the battlefields of Ukraine right now. And the Ukrainians are fighting and dying for the beliefs and the ideals that all of us in the transatlantic community have. Now, in terms of, what is going to be the impact of the midterms? How does the Republican Party stand? I have some concerns, because right now the support has been very bipartisan, and I think there is a Democratic Republican consensus. You've seen that the giant aid bills for Ukraine, and we're providing far more support and money than anybody else. They have not been controversial. Congress has actually put more money in than the Biden administration has asked for, but there is that kind of pro-Russia caucus. And the two most important and influential leaders on the right in America are basically pro-Putin. And by that, I mean Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson. They are both spreading pro-Putin, pro-Russia propaganda, Tucker in particular, and he is the most watched cable host in America. So, and there is that kind of ultra MAGA caucus within the Republican Party that, for whatever reason, you can debate why, but they love Putin. They think that he's a champion of Christianity, of white civilization, all this crap that they spread. And they're also isolationists. And so they're opposed to America aiding our allies. And there's kind of another subset of Republicans who are not isolationists, but are so focused on Taiwan and China that they think that we shouldn't be doing anything else in Europe that would detract from China and Taiwan, which is missing the big picture again, which is like the best thing we can do to save Taiwan right now is to save Ukraine and to make Russia pay a massive, horrific price for its aggression. So far, everything has been pretty much kumbaya in Congress, and almost everybody, aside from the hardcore ultra MAGA wing, especially in the House Republican caucus, everybody else has been very pro-Ukraine. But I'm concerned about what happens after November, particularly if Republicans take over the House. If the MAGA caucus grows, that will put more pressure on Kevin McCarthy not to provide so much aid to Ukraine. And one thing that we know about Kevin McCarthy is that he is very weak. He is cowardly. He refuses to stand up to Trump and his MAGA caucus. And so if Trump and his crew apply enough pressure, this could come off boards, which is why I think it's incredibly important for Congress to approve another large aid bill for Ukraine before the new Congress is seated, because right now I think is going to be the optimal time for finding bipartisan support for Ukraine's struggle for freedom.
Great point, Max. Great point. Okay, my friends, we have 16 minutes. We have 74 questions. So I would, and we're going to do this. I would ask you to unmute yourself, and I'm going to direct a question at you, and you're going to be so short and sweet. You're going to all get A pluses. Andrew Zagornuk, I'm scared to do this. Give me 2 sentences. What do you expect the Russians to do this winter? Should we expect attacks on critical infrastructure and heating facilities, or are you expecting something else?
We should expect that. Yes, there's a very high risk that they can do that, and that they will. And also, we should expect them to do a massive information war in Europe by developing that fatigue and using that frustration from the prices and so on, so to push Ukraine to negotiations. And we have to resist this by all means.
Super, you passed. General Breedlove, do you believe Ukraine might receive F-16s from either the U.S. or another ally, sir?
Not in the short term. We need to get started now, training and doing the things that will enable Ukraine to move into a 4th and 5th gen Air Force. And for that matter, all their combined arms business. We want Ukraine to be a great combined arms military.
Super, thank you. I'm not sure who wants this one, but please raise your hand. This is a great question. What was the rationale for having the counteroffensive now? No military expert says that Ukrainians had enough equipment in order to be successful. Who wants that one? General Breedlove? Oh, Zag. Okay, go ahead, Zag.
Yeah, I think that we just need to do this as soon as we can, because simply the time doesn't work for Ukraine. as soon as we have a capacity to push Russians out of any territory, we should use that. I'm not saying we should hurry. No way I'm saying we should do it at any cost. We should be really careful. But if there is an opportunity, we need to use it because time basically isn't working for us. That's it.
Super. Dara, this is for you from Viola. Viola, great to have you with us. She said you mentioned Russia is blowing through its stock of anti-ship missiles. Do you mean for land targets? Could you clarify, please?
Yeah, anti-ship cruise missiles are primarily for sea targets, but they're taking them and turning them around and firing them backwards onto the land. So they're taking existing stocks, repurposing the target base.
Super, thank you. A+. Vivian, on the nuclear plant, do you see any merit to the argument that Putin is semi-suicidally using the meltdown possibility to blackmail the West, and the IAEA visit thus becomes an instrument of this, hence Russia's cooperation with the visit? What do you make of that from John Weiss?
Honestly, if I could read Vladimir Putin's mind, I'd probably be a very wealthy woman. So I will rely on the experts here who all said that they don't believe that he's suicidal or trying that. I think, Vladimir Putin ultimately has only wanted Ukraine in his orbit, and he is trying to use whatever tools he can, whether or not he would actually do something to the power plant to, have the worst case scenario. I find that really hard to believe, but I also found it hard to believe that he'd go after Kyiv in the first place. And here we are. So, I do not think that would be the ultimate goal. I think he would love to use it as a threat, but not an actual tactic. Whether or not he does or not remains to be seen. So.
Super, thanks. Max, question for you. Are we doing enough to develop parts of our own defense industry that takes into account long-term demand from the Ukraine war? General Wesley Clark says no. What are your views, Max?
Well, I think we clearly need to ramp up production. And I think we need to be less conservative in our estimates of what we need for stockpiles, because there's a tendency to be very conservative at the Pentagon to say, oh, we can't send all these munitions to Ukraine. We can't send all these weapon systems. We need them ourselves. The reality is, we're not going to be attacking somebody with HIMARS anytime soon. We need to push everything we can to the Ukrainians right now and build more to backfill the stockpiles. And that's what we ought to be doing.
Super, thank you. General Breedlove, I see your fingers and I want to ask you a question. Go ahead, and then I'll ask you.
Well, just to add to what Max just said, not only do we need to think about our stockpiles, but we need to think about our capacity. The way that we fund defense spending for things like weapons, it's a very minimalist approach, and there's no extra. If we want to have the ability to expand, we need to signal to the industries that we need more, and we need to fund or create funding streams that allows industry to buy that excess capacity.
Super. And here's your question from Jacob Halbrun. He says, how likely is it that the Russian military will simply collapse as an effective fighting force this winter? If you're a gambling man, what's your ratio?
Well, I think they're going to last a lot longer than winter, because what we really haven't talked about is people always talk about this long war. I believe right now Russia is really focused on the winter because they need to separate the European people from European governments. And so they need to make European people cold and have no heating and no fuel oil, so that they will then bring pressure against their governments. And so I think that a part of what you see by Russia out there right now is giving up and losing a lot of capability to hold on to winter to try to win this in a political sense.
Thank you so much for bringing that in. There's an article in the Washington Post that suggests meteorologists are saying that it looks like it's going to be a warm winter. So it may be a little tougher, although Ukrainians are warning that it's going to be a cold winter in Ukraine. So I'm not sure who to believe. The Ukrainians are saying, go out and buy long underwear and get ready. So we'll see. Let's see. Next question. Zeg, question for you. Could Russia defeat the counteroffensive by falling back, let the Ukrainians advance, and then flanking them when they are exposed?
We certainly can say that we know exactly which capabilities they have. We know how many of what pieces of where are the people and so on. So I don't think they can do anything like super unexpected to us. And so the short answer is no. I don't think they can do any tactical maneuvers of that type and really expect us to be trapped or anything.
Thank you. Vivian, how effective have the Russians been at shooting down HIMARS rockets or jamming their guidance signals? Is there a learning curve?
Not the HIMARS. I mean, the HIMARS have been extremely effective so far as Russians kind of countering it. As far as a learning curve for the Ukrainians, yeah, there's definitely a learning curve. And one of the interesting things that I kept on hearing on the front lines is that they're a lot of these frontline soldiers, they hear that the HIMARS are coming, and it's a very encouraging bit of information, but they have never used Western equipment before. Most of these guys had never even touched anything but Soviet era equipment. And so the whole idea of a mid-war transfer to some sophisticated US systems was absolutely daunting for them when they're in the middle of this intense battle, and especially with HIMARS that require weeks of training. And so that's the challenge on the Ukrainian side. The Russians so far have seemed to be, have been eluded by the HIMARS, but also keep in mind, there are not that many on the ground yet. So the targets are few, and the Ukrainians have been good at disguising the HIMARS when they're not in use. And so as far as we've heard, nothing so far, but that doesn't mean that they won't figure it out when there are more HIMARS on the ground.
Thank you so much. General Breedlove, can you get into Putin's mind for us for a minute? So this is going to be, is it accurate to say that if the Russians can't conquer Ukraine, the areas that they've outlined that they want, that they're going to do the Mariupol method on Kiev? Why haven't they taken Zelensky out? And why haven't they just done to Kiev what they did to Mariupol?
Well, there's a big difference between Kiev and Mariupol. Mariupol being very close to their lines, very easy to get to. And as we saw, the world, were not paying attention to the Ukrainians, who did a magnificent job of building a defense in depth north of Kyiv, making it much tougher to take than that flatter land and access by the sea to the Mariupol in the south. And frankly, I don't think they have the force right now to even think about Kyiv. They're struggling to do what they want to do in the south. So I think that they've learned their lessons in the Kyiv. Some call it an operational loss, some call it a strategic loss. In either case, it had a huge impact on Russia and its military capability. I don't see Kyiv on the table ever.
Thank you. One more question for you from Hans Benedijk. I know you guys know each other. How optimistic is it that even with more US NATO weapons, say 60 HIMARS, Ukraine can retake all the territory occupied since February 24th in a reasonable period of time?
It would take more than just the HIMARS. I mean, and part of the problem here is the Ukrainians have proven us wrong over and over. They can assimilate high-end technology rather quickly. And so we need to start somewhere preparing them for the ability to retake that land. Can we do it in the next month or two? Maybe not, but we can make a huge impact on this counteroffensive if we take the policy decision now to give them the right kit at the right place at the right time in order to affect this counteroffensive.
I think we're gonna have to put that on mugs and t-shirts, General Breedlove. I've heard that a few times. I like that. Max, question for you. How can you claim that the Ukrainians have already won? Could this weaken resolve and help from the outside if this is repeated again and again? A challenge to you. Go ahead, Max.
Well, they've won because I think nobody here really thinks that the Russians are going to roll into Kiev anytime in the foreseeable future, and that the Ukrainian state has actually shown much greater resiliency and strength than anybody expected, and the Russians have proven much less militarily effective than I think people expected. So at this point, I mean, I think it is the case that Putin probably holds hope that at some point in the future, the Europeans will abandon Ukraine, that eventually he'll be able to bludgeon the Ukrainians down, that he'll be able to march into Odessa, cut them off from the Black Sea. I mean, I think these are probably some of the dreams that Putin still holds, but I just don't think that there is any realistic prospect of that they will achieve that. And so I think the Ukrainian state is still under threat and still fighting, but I think its viability as a state is not really in question right now.
Super, thank you. Zag, tell us about the impact of weapons being provided to Ukraine by other states other than the US. What weapon systems would you call out as being super helpful from Poland, from France, from Germany, from Estonia, from Slovakia? Go ahead.
Every nation which supplies even a small quantity contributes to the reaching critical mass. I'm a huge believer of the critical mass concept that I think we were able to change the dynamic of the war after we reached a certain number of equipment constantly operating. And so currently there are countries which are just contributing to this. And yeah, there's been a collective. So in a way, it's like a crowdfunding method. So any input is great, even when there are some nations which are run out of their own equipment, so they are providing funding and they're buying things for us. And then there are some nations which are crowdsourcing with their own people, and then they go and buy, like, for example, like Bayraktar drones, etc. So there are different ways of what people in Europe and the other countries do in order to help us, and this is amazing. But also right now there's a new challenge coming, and it's called sustaining the capabilities. So there is a question about how do we repair the equipment, how do we keep on going, how do we service it, and so on. And there are some countries which helping with this. And that's so that's a new phase of this equipment war, essentially.
There's a great paper that RUSI, the think tank in London, put out about all the different systems and the difficulty of maintaining it. I recommend that paper. Dara, beyond Kherson, what else is Ukraine's priority now, or what do you think the priority will be in the next couple of weeks this fall?
I think they've done a really good job about attacking behind the lines. Going into Crimea, I think, was completely unexpected for the Russians. They were not prepared for that outcome. It took them a few weeks to cover and cope for that, which I think they're starting to learn now. They've got more air defenses going over their critical facilities. I think unexpected uses of weapons is also having an impact. The Ukrainians are using HARM missiles. They're putting them on their aircraft, and they're using them to target Russian air defenses. So I think there is a mass problem on the Ukrainian side to have a big, large armored, counteroffensive, but these kind of pinprick attacks in targeted areas are being really effective. So I think they should continue along those lines.
Fantastic. General Breedlove, can you please help us? Tell us a bit about Ukraine's air support capabilities in the Kherson offensive. How is Ukraine trying to ensure air cover, if any?
Well, you missed a great conversation this morning about air denial, which is what Ukraine has done magnificently. It's a new term, so they haven't thought of it in that way, but they have given Russia fits in being effective with their air power over Ukraine. And so we would want that to continue. If you're following the number of sorties flown by the Ukrainian Air Force, it has surged in the last several days, much higher than, say, 3 weeks ago. So they are trying now to tie that air power to their ground maneuver. That is combined arms warfare that we haven't seen out of the Russians even. And so I believe that we see a growing understanding and capability of what that combined arms attack with air supporting the ground means to this war. And I hope to see much more of it from the Ukrainian Air Force.
Wonderful. General Breedlove, there was another question for you. Can you please give us the best arguments for why we should give weapons to Ukraine, why we should give aid? What are the most winning arguments that can be made? They deserve them. And what else, sir?
Well, I think Max said some of the most important things in the beginning. First of all, they are fighting for values just like our values. We all do not believe that Russia can take its military force and cross internationally recognized borders at will and change the map of Europe. And that's what they've done twice in Ukraine and once in Georgia since 2008. And we don't stand for that. Ukraine is a huge importance to the world and to our economies. We used to fly every rocket shot we ever flew on a Ukrainian motor. We had Motor Seats putting out some of the best motors out there, and that's why China is trying to buy Motor Seats. This is a country, people don't understand how important Ukraine is to the world, not only the West. And you don't have to look very much farther than the grain to see what it means to the southern half of the world. So there's a list too long to cover, but Ukraine is important not only to us, but to the entire world.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we did not make it. I have 80 more questions to get to. We're going to have to do this again. Thank you so much, General Breedlove, Dara Massakat, Vivian Salama. Max Boot, and the great Andrew Zagorniak. If you do not follow them on Twitter, get on Twitter now. They are all on Twitter. They are very active and they all have interesting opinions. And I learned so much today from all of you. Thank you for your reporting. Thank you for your analysis. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Please keep your eye on our website and let's do this again soon. Thank you very much. Slava Ukraini.
Slava Ukraini.